Professor David Luke. Professor is a professor in practice and strategic director at the Firoz Laji Institute for Africa at the London School of Economics and Political Science. We normally call it LSE. He is an author and of many books, including editor of these groundbreaking works, especially the How Africa Trades and How Africa Eats. We will ask him in a little bit why the topic, why Africa eats, or how Africa eats, and also how Africa trades. So we will have this really good discussion with him. Before we begin, let me extend my heartfelt appreciation to our partners, FES in Geneva. Comrades have been really, really great. Comrade Matt and his team who support and extend this solidarity work and make this series always possible. Partnerships such as this remind us that the struggle for decent work, inclusive trade, and social justice is indeed a global one. Colleagues, this is not just another webinar. This is a call to action. And so let's dig into the action. Let's have this conversation with Prof. David Luke. So, Prof, what personal or professional experiences actually inspired you and your team to write How Africa Eats? I think I understand why you have How Africa Trades, but How Africa Eats. So tell us about these two books and tell us more what we can find there, although some of us have read it.
Sure. Firstly, Hod, let me also say thank you very much for having me as part of these Trade Talks webinar series, and also thanks more broadly to ITUC-Africa for hosting this event, and our mutual partner, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung Geneva office, also has my thanks, and also ILO that always is very much interested in engaging on these issues as well. So for me, it's a great honor and privilege to be with you and to be having this conversation. I say it's an honor and privilege because many books are written and they sit on shelves and don't really have much policy influence. And we're deliberate that these books that you mentioned, How Africa Eats, How Africa Trades, that these are meant to be advocacy tools to be used for advocacy, for changing policy and so on. And so they were deliberately published on an open access basis. LSE Press uses that method of publication, which means that the books can be downloaded free by anyone, anywhere in the world, but we especially had the African audience for which the book in particular was written to be able to access the book very easily. So just to make this point. So what motivated How Africa Eats, and what more could I say about How Africa Trades? I think the titles of these two books suggest that we want to catch people's attention, and for people also, once their attention has been caught and they have looked at the book, they've read parts of it or all of it, that they would respond because it's a call to action. That's what these, the How Africa Eats book is about, the same Africa Eats book. Really, it is due to the staggering numbers that are disturbing on food insecurity on the continent. 260 million Africans, a fifth of the population, undernourished. 340 million Africans, a quarter of the population, face food insecurity or food deprivation. And Africa is also a young continent, which means that embedded in these numbers of young people whose lives are being blighted by this scourge that we have on the continent. Africa also accounts for 60% of the world's arable land. So it really begs the question, what is going on? Why this situation? So really, that's what motivated the book to look at this in depth and to look at it in a new way, because we know that some of the reasons for these staggering numbers have to do with domestic policy, that intersection around how agricultural policy is implemented and how much is invested in agriculture and so on. So we know those issues. That was one of the, if you like, the bucket of issues that we needed to look into. But we also know that food production and food consumption occurs on a global scale. And what happens in one part of the world can impact what also happens in another part of the world. So we needed to look at the trade aspect, that is, and how food trade is conducted globally. What are the rules of food trade? What are the WTO rules? And do these rules impact food security, food production on the African continent? So we needed to look at the trade dimension. Then we also thought that we know that we're facing a climate crisis. There's much that is going on. We can see extreme weather events. But beyond that, the phenomenon of global warming is a scientific fact that's been established. So we thought that we needed to look at this as well, to look to see what impact climate is having on food production, on food security. So we wanted to look at these three things, to bring together trade, to bring together policy, and to bring together climate, to look at the food security challenge at the intersection of these three policy areas. So the book is not about wholly about trade. It's not wholly about agricultural policy, and it's not wholly about climate, but it tries to bring these three together to try to get us comprehensive analysis, so to say, of the problems and the issues. So that's what motivated the book, and that's what determined the approach that we took. Very briefly, the How Africa Eats book, which was published 2 years ago, as you pointed out, the How Africa Trade book, How Africa Trade book published 2 years ago, the How Africa Eats book, was just published this year, a few months ago. So the first book, How Africa Trades, that wanted to look at the trade-related issues, trade policy in Africa, and also to try to understand and explain why Africa accounts for such a small share of global trade. What have been the issues? What are the prospects for intra-African trade, the African Continental Free Trade Area that you mentioned, and to look at these related issues. And again, to do so in a way that is, it's asking for a call to action for the kinds of measures that could be taken to reverse either the small share of Africa in global trade or these staggering numbers on food security. So let me stop here. I hope this gives you the background to the two books.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor. Let's go, into some of the issues. I mean, if you look at the how Africa trades, there is a chapter on the Africa Continental Free Trade Area and regional trade, where you map out the formal and informal flows inside Africa. You also state in the book that Africa would do better if we trade among ourselves, because a lot of manufactured goods or semi-processed goods actually traded more on the continent than extra Africa. And so, based on those insights, how can trade unions translate these lessons into strategies for workers? Because you agree with me, there is no trade without workers.
Yeah.
So what can the unions do? What can workers do? Or what advantage can be gained from this?
Okay. I think a very important point to make is that trade only happens after production has taken place. Trade is what takes the good or service that has been produced to the market. So if you like, the activity that first needs to be undertaken is production. And I think this is closely related to the interest of workers in terms of production requires labor, of course, but it's also related to the interest of workers as consumers because workers also consume the products. And actually, that's what drives any economy. Um, yes, indeed, workers need to be aware of these dynamics that we're doing better in terms of value addition, in terms of better paying jobs, in terms of formalization of economic activities when the production is oriented towards trading among ourselves, intra-African trade. Um, and the reason for this is that in the African market, the value-added products respond to the kind of demand that you find in the market. Now, what we are sending out of the continent is not what is needed in those destinations. Uh, whether it's industrial goods or whatever, there are other parts of the world that are far more industrialized than Africa is, and so really, this is not what they need from African countries. They don't need industrial products, whereas on our continent, we need those products, and which is why we import so much of industrialized and finished goods. We need these products on our continent. So what is actually happening is through inter-African trade, which, as you say, is more diversified, is that to some extent, and not yet to a full extent, but to some extent, we're beginning to meet the demand for industrial goods, industrial products on the continent, because that's not what the outside world wants from Africa. What the outside world wants from Africa is commodities, fuel, basically what we have been exporting for decades. That's basically what the outside world wants from Africa, because they use these things in their own industrial processes, and that is why also we have to be very careful in terms of development strategies, because the kind of economic miracle of Asia that relied on an export model that brought about, as I said, the economic miracle in Asia. That kind of export model is not going to work for us on the African continent, because those markets are not going to require industrialized goods from us. However, we still have room for consumption of those products on our continent, and if we can produce that ourselves, that of course would make a big difference to our overall development strategy, and as you say, to the growth of trade on the continent. And I'll just end with this last point. It's very clear when you look at the economic data that what is driving intra-African trade is consumption, and which only makes sense because the consumption too is related to the demographics on our continent. It's 1.2 billion population. It only makes sense that there is demand from that population. for goods, services, basic necessities from housing, clothing, all these things, transport, etc. And that's what's driving that higher value trade within the continent. But it's a demand that we are not yet fully able to satisfy. Because we're still importing a lot, including food and other industrial products. But all the same, we have the market, but we are not producing enough to satisfy the market.
Thank you for that. I mean, just an add-on to that. I mean, you're acknowledging, and a lot of experts acknowledge that trade is the best way to go to have that trade surplus if we can, for the economic transformation of the continent and our countries. But then AfCFTA hasn't really kicked off. Why is that? Because you talk about all these goodies, but it doesn't look like the machine is, or the wheel is moving. What has got it stuck?
Um, Firstly, let me also say that what AfCFTA does is provides a framework and rules that could apply to everyone to make trade easier. But with or without AfCFTA, uh, our producers, investors, see the opportunity in the market and are responding to that. So just to make that point, the first point. Second point to make is that AfCFTA opens up the space between our regional economic communities, because we do have the regional economic communities, which already account for much of the trade that is actually going on. The trade that is going on is within COMESA, within ECOWAS, within the East African community, within SADC, and etc. That's where the trade is really happening. What AfCFTA does is to open up the space between EAC and ECOWAS and SADC and EAC and across the REX. That is so. With or without AfCFTA, after the trade is happening, but it will be good to have AfCFTA, because then it means that the entire continent has one set of rules that everybody could follow, rather than the multiplicity of rules through the different recs, and so it just makes things easier and more predictable. But the demand, as we said, is there for goods and services driven by the demographic situation. And so that demand is being responded to irrespective of what the policymakers do. Because there's profit to be made, the businesses to be established, there's work that could draw workers into. So all that will happen, but it is good to have a predictable policy framework. So that's the goal of AfCFTA. But aside from this, also just to say that in opening up the spaces between the RECs, there's some bottlenecks, including infrastructure bottlenecks, other trade facilitation, transit-related issues across the continent, because unfortunately the colonial legacy was not one that had the infrastructure to facilitate trade between the African countries. It was really to take the trade out of the continent. So there is sorts of bottlenecks, but that is changing. Recently, I was involved in a study that looked at these corridors that are emerging. Lagos-Abidjan corridor, for example, which is, I think you're right there sitting in that on that corridor. There's the central corridor linking Dar es Salaam all the way to Eastern DRC, the northern corridor of Mombasa, Walvis Bay corridor in Southern Africa, the Durban corridor. So a lot is happening. We're also hearing about the Lobito corridor in between Angola, Zambia, Malawi, and even could potentially go as far as Mozambique, the port there, on the eastern side as well as on the western side. So all these, much is happening in terms of infrastructure to open up the continent, connect the continent, and make trade easier. So these are challenges that are there, but in spite of all of this, it is still remarkable that the trade is about 15% of total trade. It's a low number, but it is happening. Recently, I looked at other figures for the least developed countries, the LDCs on the continent. The trade is about 20% of total trade. For the landlocked developed countries, the landlocked developing countries on the continent, the trade is about 30% of total trade. What accounts for the higher proportion of that the landlocked countries have is that since they don't have access to the sea, they cannot send this stuff overseas. So you can see the dynamics that are happening. And all this is happening in spite of all the infrastructure limitations that we are talking about. But that is changing. We're seeing, as I said, these corridors, we're seeing roads, we're seeing railways, we're seeing the aviation sector also taking off. So I think step by step by step, all this is not going to happen overnight. But the value in highlighting that intra-African trade has this potential is for policymakers then to respond and for advocates, activists, stakeholders like yourselves also to be part of that conversation that this is the direction in which we need to go. We are not going to be able to export industrial products outside of the continent. The market is not there for that, but we have an internal market for these products.
Indeed, indeed, and we need the open skies policies and the free movement protocols to work so that the trade can move in all directions, and people can also cross the borders better because humans have to go with the trade. So let's turn our attention to food. I mean, Africa holds a significant portion of the world's uncultivated arable land, around 60 to 65%.
Yeah.
This potential is largely untapped due to different challenges, some you have mentioned, infrastructure, technology, investment, even policy issues. And so, I mean, in How Africa Eats, you highlight that many African nations are net food importers and depend on external food supplies, right? So as intra-African exports expand, what policies should governments and unions adopt to ensure that there is food sovereignty and food sovereignty is preserved and not undermined by liberalization?
Yeah, okay. Now we'll come to the issue of liberalization later, but I think the main point to make is that the policies are there. It's not a policy problem. We have the Comprehensive African Agriculture Development Policy, the CAADP, is a policy developed under the framework of the African Union. It aims to ensure that African countries benchmark each other on agricultural production, productivity, and so on. So we do have the policies, well thought out policies, no question about that. All the issues that need to be addressed are covered in the policy. It's being monitored. And in the book, we use at the time, the latest data from the
Utiliser
monitoring
les données,
process
les
that the
statistiques
AU has
les
in
plus
place and,
récentes au
and so
niveau
on.
de l'Union
And what we
africaine.
found out was that
Et ce que nous avons
financial
remarqué, c'est
investment is key that is holding back production. So in that sense, the problem is not a production problem. The problem also has to do with policy failures. It's very, very clear. Even the AU itself admits to the member states not investing enough in agriculture. The private sector, and we looked at this very carefully. We did an analysis of private capital formation in the agricultural sector, and we saw that private African private investment is not going into agriculture. The banks, we trace this back, look at the banks' interest rates, the smallholder model, with the banks, don't feel confident to lend to smallholders. So we have all these problems, on the financial side. We even looked at foreign direct investment. That too is not coming into agriculture. A few exceptions here and there where controversial exceptions actually, because where foreign investment has come, what it has meant is that land has been appropriated from smallholders to make that possible for foreign investors, and foreign investors are not necessarily investing to produce food for African consumption, but for export. So we highlight this. We also highlight the fact that foreign aid, which, as you know, is in a crisis. But even before the crisis, only about 8% of foreign aid was going into African agriculture. So the financial crunch is a real one. It undermines the policies. As I said, it's not a production problem. It's not even a problem of the smallholders, because we have seen that places like India have had a green revolution that is being based on the smallholder model. If our African smallholder farmers get the support that we see in other parts of the world, they can. And it's been shown they can respond. So the bottleneck is on the supply side. Excuse me, on the supply side, where the inputs, the technical know-how, the fertilizers, the rural infrastructure, that is where the limitation is. Then on the post-harvest side as well, again, the support is lacking in terms of the intermediaries for the farming produce to get to the market and so on. And in analyzing this, we realize that some of this can be traced back to the structural adjustment period, because before the structural adjustment period, you had these marketing boards that were intermediaries in the market on the supply side and on the post-harvest side, but these were swept away by the structural adjustment reforms. And then we found that in other places, I mentioned India, they have kept these institutions. These institutions were not, were not eliminated in the way that they were in the African case. So a good case to bring back these institutions in some form or the other, as market intermediaries to support smallholder production. Good case also for the banking system to be reoriented in a way that African savings, which are sitting there in the banks, chasing relatively high interest rates, which we have, that these savings could be used, to support production. So this is one part of the problem, a whole bundle of the problem. On the trade side, I'm sorry, this is a longish answer to your question. On the trade side, we also wanted to understand why it is that some crops do better than others. And the way that we try to understand this, we looked at 8 products that widely consumed on the African continent: yam, cassava, rice, maize, wheat, poultry, livestock, fish. Of these 8, we concluded that the 2 that are doing well is yam and cassava. And these 2, although of course they're endemic to Africa, they're widely grown, especially yam in West Africa, cassava throughout West and East Africa, and even parts of Southern Africa. What makes these 2 crops exceptional is that they're not subsidized in other parts of the world, because they're not widely consumed in other parts of the world, so they're not subsidized. So in other words, you don't have price suppression, which turns the farmers away from producing this. There's a market, there's a demand for this, and so the production is thriving. Again, pointing us to the fact that our problem is not a production problem. it is, has to do with these sort of policies and so on. So here the answer is global trade policies, WTO policies which allow subsidies. Crops like rice, maize, wheat, poultry, even livestock in other parts of the world, these are heavily subsidized. I mean, I'm talking about tens of billions of dollars. We're looking, places like China, 90 billion, the United States, 80 billion, the EU, 70 billion, India, over 60 billion. By the way, the median GDP of an African country is 16 billion, just to put all this in perspective. So there's heavy subsidies in other parts of the world. And what it means is that these subsidies ensure that there's production on these taking place in these related to these crops, these products.
Et que ces produits-là,
For and the African countries really cannot compete with
les pays
these
africains
sorts
ne
of
peuvent pas
subsidies
compétir
because they
avec
imagine the
ces
costs are higher
pays-là.
than the market price that other countries are able to put these products on the world market, basically. And it also means that you suffer from price suppression. It's the technical term that is used for this. You suffer from price suppression because, of the effect of the subsidy. So even in a product like fish, where we talk about the arable land, but don't forget that Continental is blessed with two oceans. Uh, or even if you like, and the two oceans and a sea, because we do have the Mediterranean on the north. But even so, we are importing fish because we don't have we cannot compete with the subsidized fishing fleets that come down our coasts, and so we don't have the capacity. So we're buying back our own fish from others who are fishing in our waters. So that is as terrible as the situation is. Of course, measures are being taken in the context of the WTO, the fisheries agreement to discipline fishery. But to come back to the problem of the subsidies, these are allowed by WTO rules. These subsidies make food available globally. But then it means that you have to buy and import these foods since you cannot produce them competitively. And that's where the trade aspect comes in, where when you look at the situation globally, you see why we are so dependent on the African continent on imports, because these key products, when you drill down to these key products, you find that you really cannot compete, except, as I say, for yam and cassava, which are the two exceptions to this, to what I've just said. Then on top of this, as we hinted earlier, we are finding that extreme weather events affecting our own production. This is not to say there's no production going on and rice, wheat, poultry, and so on. We do have, but not at the scale that satisfies our own demand. And there's even been some improvements, places like Nigeria on rice, again, following the right policies and so on. So some improvements and all that, but not yet at a scale that can satisfy our own internal demand. So this is the crux of the problem that we face. And these are, as you can see, we can fix these problems.
Régler ces problèmes,
They're not
ils ne sont pas
unsolvable. We can
des
fix them
problèmes
by
difficiles
putting
à
more
résoudre.
into
Pouvons les résoudre
agriculture,
en
investing more into
investissant
agriculture.
plus en agriculture.
Maybe not at the scale
Peut-être
of the
pas
subsidies that
au
happens in other places,
niveau
but
des
we can make a
subventions
start.
que nous
We can see where
fournissons
there's
dans
been that
certains
kind of
autres
approach.
territoires,
I
mais il y a
mentioned
eu cette
rice
approche.
in
J'ai
Nigeria,
mentionné
for
le
example,
riz,
that is possible
par
to
exemple,
then
qui peut
scale
être
up production.
Thank you
bénéficier de
for that
subventions.
very
Merci, merci
comprehensive
pour
feedback, Prof. We are at the time where
présentement
trade
à un
with
moment
other continents
le commerce avec les autres
has
continents
become even more important. The South-South
est
relations, as
devenu
we
de
call
plus
it.
en plus
I mean,
important, la
in
relation
How Africa
sud-sud.
Trades, you
Dans
analyze
l'ouvrage, vous
Africa's
avez
asymmetric trade
analysé
relationships
la relation
with the US, with the
asymétrique
EU, with
entre
China.
l'Afrique,
Why do you think
l'Union
it is so
européenne,
critical
la
for
Chine
Africa
dans le
that
commerce.
external
Pourquoi est-ce que vous
partners
pensez
engage
que c'est très
with
important que les
Africa as a bloc rather than fragment Africa's diplomacy? And I'll combine that with the question of the geopolitics of the day. You see what has happened to Lesotho in terms of the trade tariffs that have been imposed on it by the United States. We see what is happening with AGOA. It's uncertainty, but and the way Africa trades with the global North. So what is it that Africa should learn, and what can we take out of
doit
this kind of
retenir
relationship
de
with the
cette
others?
expérience et relation?
The benefit of operating as a bloc is that because our economies are so small, relatively speaking, as I said earlier, the median GDP of an African country is around
Comme je
$16
l'ai dit
billion.
plus tôt,
It's
le
relatively
PIB
small.
moyen d'un pays
You
africain
know, that's
autour
the
de
fact of when you divide
60
our
millions
economies
de
into
dollars.
53,
Quand vous
you divide Africa into
divisez
53 national economies, it does mean that individual economies are small. We have almost the same GDP as India. That is all of Africa combined, but India is one country. But when it comes to African countries, because there are 54 of us, in fact, not 53, 54 of us,
nous avons
our
53 et non
economies are
54
small. So
pays,
it only
nos
makes
économies
sense
sont
for us to
petites. Même si
coordinate
vous
as
mettez
much as
toute l'Afrique
possible,
ensemble,
act together,
notre
try to negotiate
PIB
together
ne dépasse pas
in
celle de
order to
l'Inde.
get
Alors, il faut que nous
better terms from
allions
partners. So
ensemble.
that's where that is
Et
coming
c'est pour
in.
cela
And
que nous avons
because
cette
also the world
situation.
is
Et
changing, we're moving into a
nous serait mieux
multipolar
de
world. The world is
commercer
becoming
en
much more
bloc.
transactional.
Aujourd'hui, le monde devient de
It is
plus en
also
plus
part of this
transactionnel
new
et ça fait partie de
multipolarity.
cette nouvelle multipolarité.
It also makes sense that we try
Il
to
paraît
engage in a
judicieux de
coherent
continuer
way.
à travailler
And it's sometimes
ensemble
been
d'une
disappointing
façon
to see
assez
that this is
cohérente. Et des
not
fois,
always happening.
malheureusement, ce n'est pas le
I
cas
think
et
there are
c'est
reasons for
décevant.
this.
Je pense qu'il y
One
a
of
des raisons pour
the
cela.
key reasons is that the African Union Commission
Une
does
des
not
raisons
really have a
clés
mandate to
est
negotiate on
que
behalf of
la
African
Commission
countries. The member
de l'Union
states need
africaine n'a
to
pas un
give it that
mandat
kind of
pour
mandate
négocier
to
au
be
nom
able
de tous les
to
pays africains.
have
Les pays africains
a
doivent donner
spearhead
cette responsabilité, ce
in
mandat à
dealing
l'Union africaine
with
afin qu'ils
external partners.
deviennent leur
So
ambassadeur en termes de
yes,
négociation avec les partenaires
that has been
extérieurs.
an issue.
C'est un défi.
Yes, trade policy is changing in the
Oui,
US,
les politiques
as
commerciales
we have
changent
seen.
aux États-Unis, comme vous l'avez
Uncertainty
vu.
over the Africa Growth and
Il y a eu
Opportunity
une
Act, AGOA, which of
situation
course
incertaine par rapport à
ends
l'AGOA.
today, formally, although I'm hearing
Formellement,
that
ça
there might
s'arrête
be
aujourd'hui.
some
Peut-être,
extension
et j'ai
for a
entendu,
year
j'ai
or there are
eu
issues.
écho
We'll have
qu'il
to
y
wait
a
and see what
peut-être
might happen in the next few days. But
une situation qui va se
here
passer
too,
dans
it does make sense for us to engage the US as one, rather than as
pour nous, c'est
54
toujours mieux
different
de travailler
countries.
avec
To be
les
fair,
États-Unis
behind the scenes,
en un seul bloc
diplomatically,
au lieu de
in
venir
places like Washington, I do know
en
that the African group of ambassadors do coordinate with one another and try to operate as a unit. There's also an African Union office in
il y a également un
Washington
bureau
that
de
works
l'Union
very
africaine à
closely with the
Washington
group of ambassadors. So there's a
qui
lot that is
travaille
happening behind the
avec le
scenes
groupe
that
des ambassadeurs. Il y a beaucoup d'activités qui se passent
we're not aware
derrière les
of
rideaux.
as such.
Et c'est une,
So I just hope that
nous ne
all
sommes
the
pas au
diplomatic
courant, mais
activity
j'espère
that's
que
going on
toutes les activités
could
diplomatiques en cours
help to
nous
bring AGOA back
permettront
on track. It was a good
de
program.
remettre l'AGOA
It does not
en
require
marche. C'était
reciprocal market access for the US. The
un
US
bon
never
cadre, un
asked
bon
for that.
environnement.
it's
Ce
a
n'était pas
non-reciprocal agreement. You
un
mentioned
accord
asymmetry.
de réciprocité
I'm of the view
asymétrique.
that where you have
La-
asymmetrical
les États-Unis
economies,
n'avaient pas
we usually
demandé une
give
ouverture de notre marché
the smaller
total. Alors,
economy
vous voyez,
time to
quand
grow.
nous avons des accords
Otherwise,
asymétriques, nous donnons la
what
permission aux petites
as much
économies
as
de croître.
inter-African trade is
Et
growing,
lorsque nous regardons
we're
aujourd'hui
still
le
having
commerce
trade diversion.
inter-africain
That
en termes
is,
de croissance, il y a
other
une diversion.
countries
Il y a d'autres
displacing
pays
what we could
qui
actually produce
continuent
ourselves on the
à
continent.
nous
And
mettre,
behind
pour nous
every
envoyer des
product
produits
that
que
is
nous pouvons produire
displaced,
nous-mêmes sur le
as trade
continent.
unionists, you know that
Et
there
en
are
termes
jobs behind that, and we
d'emploi,
have
vous
a
savez,
leadership
vous, les
situation
centrales
such that
syndicales, notre situation
we do need
démographique
to
est structurée de
maximize
façon à ce que nous avons
production
besoin
on the
de
continent
maximiser la
and create
production
those
sur le
jobs,
continent afin de
both
créer
for
les
workers
emplois
and also as
pour les
consumers
travailleurs ainsi
of
que pour
these
les
products.
consommateurs de ces produits.
So, the point here is that yes, there
Oui,
are
ce que je cherche à dire
benefits
ici, c'est que oui,
in
il y a des
joining parties
avantages
as a
en
bloc,
termes
speaking with one voice,
d'intégration ou de
which is
discussion
what the
avec
African
les
Union
partenaires
itself has
d'une seule
advocated.
voix,
That is what
aller
the
en
state
groupe de
should do,
pays,
but
et c'est ce que les États
we
doivent
tend
faire.
to
Mais nous
operate and
avons
bring
tendance
resources,
à
including
plutôt
advantage,
négocier de
as we
façon
try to overcome that.
séparée et nous devons
All
essayer
right. Let me now
d'arrêter de faire cela.
come to the very last
Merci.
question, and hopefully
Permettez-moi de
we
poser la
open the
dernière
floor
question et
for
avec
a
cela,
few
nous allons
more from
donner
my
la parole
colleagues online
pour,
before
à nos collègues en
we
ligne
close.
pour qu'ils puissent poser des
How
questions.
do we build on union
Comment est-ce que
efforts,
nous
right? How do we get that
pouvons
muscle up?
renforcer
I mean, based on your talk so
l'effort
far,
des centrales syndicales,
you
des
emphasizing,
syndicats?
and I think
En
both
regardant ce que
books,
vous avez présenté, vous
the
avez
capacity gaps in
bien
African trade policy.
réitéré
So
ou
if unions have
précisé
to
les
pick
écarts dans les politiques
any
de
area
commerce
or any
africaines.
three
Si
areas, should it be
aujourd'hui
on trade
les centrales
analysis?
syndicales doivent se
Should
concentrer
we
sur
focus on
trois aspects
legal negotiations?
politiques,
Should
sur quoi
we turn
devons-nous nous
our
concentrer?
attention
Les
to
négociations
monitoring, or if there's any other
légales
area,
et
what
le
should be the
suivi
focus for
ou autre
unions
chose?
so
Que
that
doit
we
être
can help push this
l'aspect sur lequel
trade
les centrales
agenda
syndicales
even forward and
se
better,
concentrent afin
minding the
de
fact that
mieux
we want to
renforcer
see social clauses in these agreements. We want to see
le
labor
succès de ces
provisions
accords. Nous
in these
voulons voir
agreements.
là,
But
une
from
protection
which
des filets
angle should
sociaux
we
dans ces
tackle
accords. Nous
this?
voulons
What
voir
would be your maybe
de
your
meilleurs
advice?
emplois. Mais quels
I would
seraient
say
vos
all of the
conseils?
above.
Je dirais tout.
Yeah, that you need to be engaged in trade analysis,
Vous devez
for sure, to
Alors,
see,
il faut dire
understand
que je
what's
dirais les
happening
deux.
on the
Et pour comprendre tout
negotiations,
ce qui se passe, les
need
négociations et tout,
to ensure that
il faut
our
s'assurer
negotiations do
que nos
take into account
négociations
the asymmetries
prennent
that
en
we're talking
compte
about.
les asymétries dont
Those
nous
are,
discutons ici.
very important.
Et ce sont des éléments
And
assez
then on the
importants.
monitoring,
Et
I think
également
that
sur
is equally important.
le contrôle,
So I would say that you have to be
je
active on
dirais
all fronts,
qu'il faut être très
for
actif sur
sure,
tous les champs
and to be engaging policymakers on all these
et de
issues.
rendre compte aux
I think
décideurs sur toute
two
cette
key
thématique.
things which we
Je
should come
voudrais
back
dire
to.
deux éléments essentiels à
On
mentionner.
the food security side,
Par rapport
really
à
we
la
have to
sécurité
get down these
alimentaire,
numbers.
il faut vraiment
Because
réduire ces
basically what this means
statistiques-là, il
is
faut
that
les réduire parce que fondamentalement, ce
food
que cela
insecurity
suppose,
is related to
c'est que
poverty
la
on the
sécurité
continent.
alimentaire est liée à la
These numbers
pauvreté
that I
sur le
mentioned,
continent. Euh,
a quarter of the
Ces statistiques que j'ai
population,
mentionnées par
a
rapport
fifth
à
of
la
the population
démographie et tout,
facing either food deprivation or
et
food
un quart ou
insecurity
un
is
cinquième de la population
massive numbers.
qui sont
So
vulnérables à ce phénomène, en fait,
476 million
d'insécurité
Africans,
alimentaire.
that is
Et donc,
a
ce
third
sont
of the
des
population,
statistiques assez conséquentes. Et
classified as poor
mais il faut dire
one
que
dollar
jusqu'à
a day,
476 millions
$1 a
d'Africains
day
sont
level.
classifiés comme
And why is
des
this?
euh,
And that is
populations assez
because
pauvres parce qu'ils
lack of jobs.
euh,
They, for
vivent en
everything
dessous
that we're
de
importing
1 dollar
into the
par jour.
continent, jobs have been
Et
lost.
cela a à voir
That's
avec tout ce
the
qui se
simple
passe
equation.
surtout
It doesn't mean that we
l'importation
should have a closed
sur le
economy,
continent.
but it does mean that
Et
we should be
que
smart.
cela fait que
We
l'on perd
always
des
say
emplois et tout.
trade is importing and exporting.
Le commerce
So
est
it's not a closed
important,
economy we're talking about here. But the fact
mais
is that
c'est que le
we're
fait
so
est
far
qu'il faut
behind in
il faut le dire que nous sommes très en retard par rapport à ces données-là que nous avons mentionnées et qu'il faut vraiment faire plus pour réduire le taux de pauvreté. Tel que je l'ai dit, la nourriture est disponible, mais ce que les gens ne peuvent pas avoir, c'est en termes de nutrition, des éléments nutritifs qu'il faut avoir. Et pourquoi cela? Et il faut dire, le chômage également est assez élevé sur le continent et cela est lié également à la pauvreté. Et le chômage est assez élevé parce que nous ne produisons pas à grande échelle. Nous ne pouvons pas, de ce fait-là, ce n'est pas assez constructif et durable pour nous d'être des importateurs massifs de marchandises parce que l'emploi est lié à la croissance et c'est comme cela que l'économie marche, tel que vous le savez, et tous ces éléments sont interconnectés. Donc, je pense que je voudrais dire que l'analyse des données avec les négociations juridiques, avec les intérêts et le suivi que nous avons, tout cela est lié. C'est une grande opportunité pour ce syndicat de coordonner et de faire preuve de leadership à travers ces discussions en termes de changement de politique que nous voulons observer et tout. Il faut dire que le mouvement canadien est assez authentique en termes de voir le monde réel d'emploi et des consommateurs et des personnes telles que vous le savez, et cela rend un peu la chose plus abstraite, mais c'est un mouvement qui est assez authentique. Ils disposent d'une voix. Il faut dire que c'est des différents partis de la société civile qui sont engagés et tout, mais souvent l'authenticité, c'est ces mouvements syndicaux, c'est ce qu'ils peuvent apporter. Et je crois que intellectuellement parlant, la société civile peut évaluer tout ce paysage d'activités florissantes et tout, et cela montre que si les syndicats sont assez actifs, nous allons voir des changements opérés en termes de distribution et de productivité et de croissance économique, etc. Donc, il n'y a pas de question de dire que nous sommes en train de voir depuis les 200 années, il n'y a pas eu ces changements qui se sont opérés dans d'autres endroits du monde sont vraiment connectés aux efforts syndicaux.
Thank you so much.
Merci beaucoup. Et également, vous le savez,
throwing back the challenge
pour rendre le défi
It's almost saying, okay, I have given
aux
you the
syndicats. Il y en a qui
you
disent,
run with
oui,
it.
vous
And
avez les évidences, il faut faire avec. Et absolument. Et croyez-moi, c'est que nous allons le faire et voir dans quelle mesure nous pouvons accompagner.
Professor, we have
Et
a few
professeur, donc,
questions online,
nous avons quelques questions en
I will
ligne
see if we will still
et
have
je vais
time
voir si nous avons assez de temps encore pour
take
voir comment est-ce que nous pouvons prendre quelques de ces questions-là et voir. Alors, j'encourage les collègues à vraiment être précis dans leurs questions et je vais lire quelques-unes et que nous allons voir. Et cela vient du camarade Sénat. Quels défis environnementaux ou climatiques
when the already intense climate shocks on the African continent that African nations are facing? I think this one is in French, was about the interpretation. And then there's another one from Comrade Prince from LRS. Trade or transport and agriculture in Africa are seen as contributors to climate change and are also negatively affected by extreme weather events associated with climate change. How do we promote agriculture and trade among African countries without compromising the environment. Lastly, let me just add this one from a text message that I've seen. Colleagues are using all the platforms available to them. It says that Africa's push towards AfTA has overlooked several foundational elements for trade, which is industrialization and industry development. This breeds some risks. So she lists them. Industry development policies are dead. All African countries lack coherent national industrialization strategies. Energy access is a problem. Institutional coordination is a problem. Skills and human capital development, FDI targeting, and then productivity capacity. So, cocktail of issues. How do we get out of
Un
this?
cocktail de problèmes. Alors, comment est-ce qu'on s'en sort,
Okay, let's
professeur?
begin with the last one. Yeah,
Je vais commencer avec le dernier.
Faced and different countries, face them in various ways. Yeah, you point out a cocktail, but the ingredients of the cocktail do not apply everywhere. So without any question, I think I would put my, emphasize that, yeah, these are all the issues that we need to deal with. Energy is critical, is one of the key bottlenecks, whether in production, also in relation to the food questions that we've been discussing and so on. But that does not mean that we cannot make progress. We can still make progress. We are making progress. I don't want to leave this webinar in a pessimistic on a pessimistic note, because I think we are making progress. You can see much is going on the continent, but these are the sort of key challenges that on average the average African country faces. On agriculture and climate change, yes, indeed, agriculture is itself an
Vous le
emitter
savez,
emissions
cela est dû aux émissions. Et quand on parle de pratiques,
developed and are being used on the continent. Research shows that many parts of the continent there's an uptake in utilizing sustainable practices, in utilizing how much water, for example, goes into agricultural production and how to harness the water. So there's a lot that is going on sustainable practices. We need to scale up, of course, in regard to this. All of this falls under the adaptation aspect of how we relate to climate change. It is underfunded. We're also aware of that, and there's a huge debate over on this particular issue of financing adaptation and so on. But increasingly the knowledge is there on how to ensure that agriculture can follow sustainable practices, and in many places this has been followed. Then I think the first question had to do with climate and the, sort of related to this, what I've just been saying, climate and environmental challenges, the shocks and so on. So this is well established that, and you could recall some recent incidences, whether it's flooding in Mozambique, Malawi, of course, endemic drought in the northern part of West Africa, also in the Horn of Africa. So these challenges have been long established. Also, the rising sea levels affecting coastal areas and so on. So so these are all the issues that are there. And goes back again to this question of adaptation. and one of the things we did was to look at the nationally determined contributions of African countries. They're not short of policies and solutions to these issues, which is quite impressive, the level of awareness. But the financing and implementation is where many countries fall short, far inadequate from what is needed. So what we see is an incremental approach to these sorts of problems, which are, by no stretch of imagination enough. But all the same, as I said earlier, we're seeing that yes, with all the incrementalism, we're seeing progress and on along in some way. So I remain optimistic. As I say, I don't want to leave this conversation on a pessimistic note. I remain optimistic that we are understanding the problems better. And I think that's really the first step towards overcoming these issues. The analysis that we draw upon very insightful. The identifying what the problems are, and this is also reflected in these few comments that have been made. But but we remain optimistic, and I think as activists, we continue to push for a better tomorrow on the continent.
Thank you very much, Professor David Look. And if you joined us midway, you have been getting advanced lessons on trade and and economic transformation, for Africa by Professor David Look of LSE. And it's been great having him so far. Prof, we have two more questions, and then we will call it a day. I see a question from Comrade Etire. By the way, the one I read from my text was from Comrade Vimbai. Comrade Vimbai, I hope you got your answer. This one is from Comrade Etire, who says, trade and food are not neutral. They are questions of power, justice, and rights. What key strategies would you recommend to African trade unions as defenders of workers' dignity in the food and trade systems shaping the continent's future? And then we have this from Sister Eviolata. As part of the call, how can we make food security through agriculture an attractive enterprise for young people? What opportunities through digitization are emerging for this to happen? All right, so these are the questions. And then we have one that is in French. This is not challenging at all. We have our interpreters on the call. Interpreters, can you tell us, is it possible for you to ask the question in English for us? If you see what is on the platform in French, and then I'll go ahead and read the one in the last one in English. Yes, please, if you have your questions, put them on the platform so we don't waste time asking.
Si vous avez des questions, mettez-les sur la plateforme. So, hello all.
For the interpreters, or do we?
Can you hear us?
Yes, we can hear you.
Question.
Translate the one in French for us.
Hello, I am Fendi Nyawi Clarisse. I am a trade person and I'm also a member of the Trade Union of Benin Republic. Concerning negotiation agreements in trade through African Union, don't you see that some of these negotiations hold the screen is very, some of these negotiations do not hold some traps that do not benefit African countries? We have to ask our decision makers to review these agreements before they sign them. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. And then the last question from Comrade Mohammed. And what about the link with energy security and the energy transition as a means to reduce the debt burden and consequently to enhance resilience and food security? Could climate smart agriculture, adaptation measures, and proactive trade policies be considered strategic pathways to address the continent's challenges from a structural perspective? That is, quite some questions you have there for you to deal with before we let you go.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, now the last the question that was translated, I think I fully agree. These are all issues that need to be tackled. As I said, sustainable agriculture, climate smart agriculture, this is emerging. In fact, you could make the case that the line between agriculture and industry is becoming blurred because now you need to have the scientific knowledge that can uh, support production at scale, taking into account issues like the soil chemistry, the rainfall, either extremes that can be experienced, and how the water can be harvested and harnessed, and so on. Seed varieties that can uh, produce yields even with extreme weather conditions and so on. So the kind of knowledge that is going into climate smart agriculture is as complicated as the knowledge going into manufacturing. And that's why someone's saying the line between the two is becoming blurred. And that actually also feeds into the question about how to make agriculture attractive to young people. Agriculture now is a complex activity, as I've just said, with the kind of knowledge that is needed. I think for young people, if the kind of support, it goes back to the support that I was talking about, if the kind of support is available, including the financing, I think young people will respond to any opportunity that is out there. Our land tenure systems, to me, is not a problem. I know that some see it as an issue. I don't see it as an issue. Quite frankly, I think that our smallholder system, our community-based communal systems does ensure that there is inclusive access to land because it is a finite resource after all. So I think that is something that we can use in a very positive way for access to land and for young people also to benefit from that. I also agree with the point that trade and food security are not neutral. The issues of justice, rights, on these on these questions, and yes, indeed, and I think that's why we're having this discussion, and I think we're getting better at identifying precisely where action needs to be taken, not in a sort of generalized way, but in a very specific ways. And I think we need to keep this in mind that yes, we want to see inclusion, we want to see fairness, equity. I think these are all values that are important to ensure that societies are cohesive, and to also to ensure that we have stability in our society. So this is not something we can ignore. So the very fact of identifying the numbers that we started off this conversation with that face food security challenges is a good starting point so that we can see the scale of the problem and how to respond to that. So I hope this answers these issues that have been raised. Yeah.
Thank you very much, David. I tell you what, if we could, with the unions, we are happy to, keep you for a very long time. But we know you are very
But we should
busy.
do this again. I think we should do this again.
I agree with you.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
I agree with you. Thank you so much, comrades, colleagues, and friends. At this point, we would like to conclude this session. I know some of you may have wanted to speak, but then we did not have time to address your direct questions. But I appreciate those who put these questions in the chat, and we have still been able to address them. I bring you very warm greetings from ITUC-Africa General Secretary Kwame Joel Makato, or DJ. He wasn't able to participate here. He's currently in Angola, solving some of Africa's biggest problems in that part of the continent, and he extends his warmest regards. He's a very big fan of trade and economic transformation for Africa. So I'm sure he will take much delight in watching the webinar video later on. So today's dialogue has been both rich and timely. Together, I'm sure we have examined how the AfCFTA can be leveraged not only for trade integration, but for inclusive development, for the decent work, for food sovereignty that we all desire. So I want to thank you so much, our distinguished guest, Professor David Luke, for sharing these insights on the two books, How Africa Trades and How Africa Eats. I know you have an unveiling ceremony in Geneva very soon with the FES, with Comrade Matt. I wish you well in that ceremony, and hopefully, if I can ask for anything from you, I would say try and get us some copies so that we can continue with the advocacy on the continent. Finally to all the participants here, trade union leaders, policy makers, civil society allies, researchers and friends, thank you all so much for engaging on the subject and for joining us. And I can't also thank FES Geneva enough for the continuous support. And we hope to meet you again in another session, and we continue the capacity building and the advocacy that will drive all of us to that point that we also desire, the economic transformation that we all need, we all want for Africa. Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor. Thank you all. I'll see you sometime.
Yes, sir. Thank you too. And thanks to everyone. Okay.
Viva, 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 comrades.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.